judge.
Well said.
Well, they released her, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
That's good to know. Okay, no more swearing.
Okay.
Okay, no more swearing.
Okay.
Righty then. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to Weekly Marx. Today, we are going to continue Karl Marx Capital Volume 1, Chapter 23, the 2024 Princeton edition. The General Law of Capitalist Accumulation. I've included, as always, the Ed George notes and the Harry Cleaver outline to this chapter. It's not totally too long, but it's there. But I've also included, of course, as I said, the outline for chapter 25, and a fairly important chapter in terms of talking about capitalist accumulation and talking about those important elements, the composition of capital, etc., and also stating the kind of historical context and Malthus, etc. So here we go. General law of capitalist accumulation. Number one, the demand for labor power increases when accumulation occurs if the composition of capital stays the same. When capital increases, this implies that its variable component, the part that becomes labor power, increases as well. Part of the surplus value that has been turned into surplus capital has to be reverse transformed into variable capital. That is an addition to the labor fund. Let's assume that all conditions remain the same, including the composition of capital. It always takes the same amount of labor power to set a given amount of the means of production or constant capital in motion. If this is so, then both the demand for labor and the workers' subsistence funds will clearly increase in the same proportion as the capital, and the faster the capital grows, the faster they will grow. The capital produces surplus value each year, part of which is added each year to the original capital. This addition itself becomes larger each year as the amount of the capital already functioning increases. And, moreover, the scale of accumulation can expand suddenly due to a simple change in how the surplus value or surplus product is divided between capital and revenue, something that tends to occur when the drive for wealth is stimulated in special ways, such as when new markets or new spheres of investment open up as a result of newly developed social wants and needs. For all these reasons, capital's accumulation requirements can exceed the amount by which labor power increases, or by which the number of workers does, and the demand for workers can exceed the labor supply, causing wages to rise. Complaints about higher wages resounded in England during the entire first half of the 18th century. But the more or less favorable circumstances in which wage laborers maintain themselves and multiply do nothing to alter how, at bottom, capitalist production works. Just as simple reproduction continuously reproduces the capital relation itself, with capitalists on one side facing wage laborers on the other, so too reproduction on an ever larger scale, in other words, accumulation, reproduces the capital relation on an ever larger scale, with more and or bigger capitalists on one side facing more wage laborers on the other. Labor power, which has to be continuously incorporated into capital as a means of valorization, can't twist free of capital. Its bondage under capital is merely concealed because workers sell their labor power to a succession of different capitalists. And we've already seen that, in fact, the reproduction of labor power constitutes a core aspect of capital's accumulation. The accumulation of capital is therefore the propagation of the proletariat. We have mentioned how well classical political economy understood this principle so well that Adam Smith, Ricardo, and others mistakenly treated accumulation as what occurs when productive workers consume the entire capitalized part of the surplus product, i.e., when the surplus product is transformed into additional wage laborers. As early as 1696, John Bellers wrote, quote, "If one had 100,000 acres of land and as many pounds in money and as many cattle without a laborer, what would the rich man be but a laborer? As the laborers make men rich, so more the laborers. There will be the more rich men, the labor of the poor being the minds of the rich," unquote. And there is Bernard de Mandeville at the beginning of the 18th century, quote, "It would be easier where property was well secured to live without money than without poor, for who would do the work? As they, the workers, ought to be kept from starving, so they should receive nothing worth saving. If here and there one of the lower class, by uncommon industry and pinching his belly, lifts himself above the condition he was brought up in, nobody ought to hinder him. Nay, it is undeniably the wisest course for every person in the society, and for every private family to be frugal, but it is the interest of all rich nations that the greatest part of the poor should almost never be idle, and yet continuously spend what they get. Those that get their living by their daily labor have nothing to stir them up to be serviceable but their wants, which is it is prudence to relieve, but folly to cure. The only thing, then, that can render the laboring man industrious is a moderate quantity of money, for as too little will, according to as his temper is, either dispirit or make him desperate. So too much will make him insolent and lazy. From what has been said, it is manifest that in a free nation where slaves are not allowed of, the surest wealth consists in a multitude of laborious poor, for besides that they are the never-failing nursery of fleets and armies, without them there could be no enjoyment, and no product of any country could be valuable. To make the society, which of course consists of non-workers, happy and people easy under the meanest circumstances, it is requisite that great numbers of them should be ignorant as well as poor. Knowledge both enlarges and multiplies our desires, and the fewer things a man wishes for, the more easily his necessities may be supplied, unquote. What Mandeville, an honest and intelligent man, hadn't yet grasped is that the very mechanism of the accumulation process increases not only the amount of capital, but along with it, the number of the, quote, laboring poor, unquote, i.e., the wage laborers who transform their labor power into the increasing capital's growing power to valorize itself and are thereby forced to perpetuate their relationship of dependence with their own product, which is personified in the figure of the capitalist. In his The State of the Poor, or A History of the Laboring Classes in England, Sir Frederick Morton Eden remarks about this relationship, quote, "The natural produce of our soil is certainly not fully adequate to our subsistence. We can neither be clothed, lodged, nor fed, but in consequence of some previous labor. A portion, at least, of the society must indefatigably employed. There are others who, although they neither toil nor spin, can yet command the produce of industry, but who owe their exemption from labor solely to civilization and order. They are peculiarly the creatures of civil institutions, which have recognized that individuals may acquire property by various other means besides the exertion of labor. Persons of independent fortune owe their superior advantages by no means to any superior abilities of their own, but almost entirely to the industry of others. It is not the possession of land or of money, but the command of labor, which distinguishes the opulent from the laboring part of the community. What speaks to laborers is not an abject or servile condition, but a state of easy and liberal dependence, which gives the people of property sufficient influence and authority over those who are here supposed to be employed to work for them. As all who know human nature and its history will allow, such a state is necessary for the laborer's own comfort. Unquote. Let us note in passing that Sir F.M. Eden was the only one of Smith's students who had achieved something of significance by the end of the 18th century. The conditions of accumulation we have been presupposing are comparatively good for workers. In fact, under these conditions, the workers' relation with capital, their relationship of dependence, is dressed in bearable forms, or as Eden says, easy and liberal ones. Instead of becoming more intense as capital increases, this relation merely becomes more extensive. Capital's sphere of exploitation and dominion, or domination, merely expands when capital itself is enlarged, and the number of its wage laborers increase. In the form of the means of payment, a bigger part of the worker's own constantly increasing surplus product comes back to him from the surplus capital into which that product is continuously being transformed. This enables workers to extend the range of their enjoyments, add to their fund for the consumption of clothes, furniture, etc., and build up a modest reserve fund of cash. But such things don't wipe away the wage laborer's relationship of dependence and his exploitation any more than better clothes, food, and treatment, and a larger peculium do that for the slave. When the price of labor rises as a result of the accumulation of capital, this says only that the weight and length of the golden chain the worker has already forged for himself allow him to loosen it just a bit. The essential point here, namely the differentia specifica of capitalist production, has been mostly overlooked in the debates about this question. The capitalist doesn't buy labor power to satisfy one of his personal wants or needs with the service or product that the labor power brings about. His aim is to valorize his capital, to produce commodities containing more labor than he has to pay for, so that a component of their value costs him nothing, yet is realized when the commodities are sold. The production of surplus value, that is, profit-making, is the absolute law of this mode of production. Labor power can be sold only insofar as it preserves the means of production as capital, reproduces its own value as capital, and in unpaid labor provides a source of surplus capital. Whether the worker sells his labor power more or less advantageously, the conditions of its sale imply that it has to be resold continuously, and that wealth is reproduced as capital on an ever larger scale. As we have seen, the nature of wage labor is such that the worker must always supply a certain quantity of unpaid labor. Even if we disregard the scenario where wages rise while the price of labor falls, a rise in wages indicates at least a merely quantitative decrease in the amount of unpaid labor. Even the worker has to perform. The decrease can never reach the point where it seriously threatens the capitalist character of the production process and the reproduction of its basic conditions, namely the means of production and subsistence, existing as capital on one side and labor power as a commodity on the other side, or the capitalist existing on one side of the capital relation and the wage laborer on the other. Apart from violent conflicts over the rise of wages, and Adam Smith has shown that the master generally remains the master when these occur, an increase in labor's price caused by the accumulation of capital implies the following alternatives. Either as prices rise, or after they have risen, the absolute growth of accumulation increases by an equal or even greater amount. We know that even when all other circumstances, e.g., how productive labor is, remain the same, the magnitude of the advanced capital can grow, and its absolute growth can stay constant or even accelerate, while the rate of accumulation falls. We saw this in section 3 of chapter 9. We also know that the amount of surplus value can remain the same and, in fact, increase even as the rate of surplus value falls, as long as the number of workers being exploited at the same time increases. Here, it would be tautological to say that labor power's reduced exploitation doesn't prevent capital from extending its domination. Or we have the other alternative, then accumulation slackens because the price of labor rises, dulling the spur of profit. Accumulation decreases, but when this happens, the very circumstance that caused it to decrease disappears, namely the disproportion between capital and exploitable labor power. As a result, the price of labor decreases, returning to a level where it aligns with capital's valorization requirements. It hardly follows, then, that wages have to fall to their minimum level or to the level where they were before the price of labor rose. The mechanism of the capitalist production process thus clears away the obstacles it temporarily creates for itself. One can see that in the first case, excess capital doesn't arise because of a decrease in the rate at which labor power or the number of workers increases either absolutely or in relative terms. Rather, the reverse happens. The amount of exploitable labor power becomes insufficient because capital increases. In the second case, the amount of capital doesn't become insufficient because the amount of labor power or the size of the working population increases, whether in absolute or relative terms, at a faster rate. Rather, the reverse happens. The amount of exploitable labor power, or rather its price, becomes excessive because the amount of capital decreases. These absolute movements in the accumulation of capital are reflected as relative movements in the amount of exploitable labor power, and thus they appear to be produced by the latter's movements. When commodity prices generally fall during the crisis phase of the industrial cycle, this decrease is thus expressed as an increase in the relative value of money. And when commodity prices generally increase during the prosperity phase, the rise is expressed as a decrease in money's relative value. The so-called currency school took from this that when prices are high, too much money is circulating, and when prices are low, too little money is. Their ignorance and complete misunderstanding of the facts find worthy analogs in the political economists who interpret the aspects of accumulation discussed above in such a way that in the one case, there aren't enough wage laborers, and in the other, there are too many of them. Mystified to the point of becoming a natural law, the law of capitalist accumulation, in fact, expresses that the nature of capitalist accumulation precludes all decreases in the exploitation of labor and increases in labor's price large enough to seriously jeopardize the constant reproduction of the capital relation and its reproduction on an ever larger scale. It can't be otherwise in a mode of production where the worker is there to satisfy the valorization requirements of existing value instead of the reverse, where objective wealth would be there to provide the worker with what he needs for his human development. In the realm of religion, people are ruled by a product of their own heads, and it is just so in capitalist production, except that there are people that here people are ruled by the products of their own hands. Number 2, variable capital decreases in relative terms during the course of accumulation and the concentration that accompanies it. What we have explicated so far holds if we presuppose that in the course of accumulation no change occurs in the ratio between the amount of the means of production and the amount of labor power moving them, i.e. the demand for labor and capital's growth increase proportionally. In his analysis of accumulation, Adam Smith treats this presupposition as a self-evident axiom. What he overlooks is that as accumulation takes place, a revolution occurs in the ratio between the means of production and the labor power that moves them. This revolution is reflected in the changing composition of capital's value, that is, in the varying ratio between the capital's constant and variable components, or between the value components that are turned into the means of production and labor power. I call this composition capital's organic composition. If we set aside natural conditions such as the fertility of the soil and also the skill of the producers, working independently of and apart from one another, something that in any case manifests itself more in the quality of the product produced than its quantity, the degree of labor's social productivity is expressed as the relative amount of the means of production that a worker turns into products when he activates his labor power for a given amount of time at a given level of intensity. When the productivity of his labor increases, he works with a greater amount of the means of production. These means play a double role here, that of the result and the condition of labor's growing productivity. The amount of some means of production increases because labor's productivity does, while the amount of others has to increase before labor's productivity can. When the division of labor emerged in the manufacturing workshop and machines were introduced, a greater quantity of raw material was worked on in the same amount of time. A greater quantity of raw material and auxiliary materials entered the labor process as a consequence of labor's enhanced productivity. On the other hand, a certain amount of machines, beasts of burden, mineral manures, drain pipes, and such things had to be in place in order for labor's productivity to increase, as does a certain amount of the means of production concentrated in buildings, giant furnaces, the means of transport, etc. But labor's increased productivity is expressed as a greater amount of the means of production relative to the labor power incorporated into them. Whether the new amount arises as a condition or consequence of that increased productivity, which thus also appears as a decrease in the amount of labor relative to the amount of the means of production moved by labor, or as a reduction in the subjective factor of the labor process as compared with its objective factors. The increase in the amount of the means of production relative to the amount of labor power that moves them is reflected in the fact that the constant capital's share of the total capital share increases at the expense of the variable capital's share. Suppose a mass of capital was at first divided equally. 50% went into the means of production and 50% went into labor power. But then labor's productivity increased, causing the capital to be redistributed. Now 80% of the capital goes into the means of production and 20% goes into labor power. This reduction of the variable part relative to the constant part, or the altered constitution of the capital value, is only an approximate expression of how the constitution of its material components is changed. Take, for example, the spinning industry. 7/8 of the capital currently spent here is constant capital, and 1/8 is variable capital. Whereas at the beginning of the 18th century, 1/2 of the capital was constant and 1/2 variable, the amount of raw materials and means of labor and the amount of raw materials and means of labor now consumed productively by a given amount of spinning labor is many hundreds of times as much as it was back then. The reason for this is simple. The amount of the means of production consumed increases when labor's productivity does, but the value of those means decreases relative to how much of them there are. Their value increases in absolute terms, but not in proportion to their mass. So the difference between the constant capital's share of the total capital and the variable capital's share increases much less than the difference between the amount of the means of production that the constant capital is turned into and the amount of labor power the variable capital is spent on. The former difference increases as the latter does, but to a much smaller degree. In part 4 of this work, we showed that labor's social productive power requires cooperation on a large scale in order to develop, that it is only when this precondition is met that the division and combination of labor can be organized. The means of production can be used more economically as a result of their massive concentration. Means of labor physically suited only for collective use, for example, systems of machines, can be brought into being. Enormous natural forces can be pressed into the service of production, and the production process can be successfully transformed into the technological application of scientific knowledge. There is only one way this precondition can be realized in the context of commodity production, where the means of production belong to private persons, and artisans either make commodities as isolated and independent producers, or, lacking the means needed for independent production, sell their labor power as a commodity. Namely, it can arise only when individual masses of capital are enlarged, or only in proportion to the extent to which the social means of production and subsistence are transformed into the private property of capitalists. Functioning as a foundation, commodity production can support just one form of production on a large scale, the capitalist form. A certain accumulation of capital in the hands of individual commodity producers, therefore, constitutes the necessary precondition for the specific capitalist mode of production. Hence, when we examine the transition from craft labor to capitalist industry, we had to presuppose such accumulation. We can call this original accumulation, since it is the historical foundation, not the historical result of specifically capitalist production. For the moment, we don't need to examine how much accumulation emerged. It's enough to establish that this original accumulation represents the starting point. But since all the methods for increasing labor's social productive power that develop on this basis are simultaneously methods for increasing the production of surplus value or surplus product, the constitutive element of accumulation, these methods are also ways of using capital to produce capital, or of accelerating its accumulation. The continuous reverse transformation of surplus value into capital is now expressed as the increasing magnitude of the capital that goes into the production process. This, in turn, becomes the foundation for production on an expanded scale, the attendant methods for increasing labor's productive power, and the accelerated production of surplus value. If a certain level of capital's accumulation therefore appears as a precondition for the specifically capitalist mode of production, that mode of production reacts back on the accumulation of capital, causing it to accelerate. Thus, when the accumulation of capital develops, so does the specifically capitalist form of production. And when the specifically capitalist form of production develops, so does the accumulation of capital. Individual masses of capital are larger or smaller concentrations of the means of production, and accordingly command larger or smaller armies of workers. Every instance of accumulation becomes the means by which accumulation occurs anew. As it enlarges the amount of wealth functioning as capital, accumulation increases the concentration of that wealth in the hands of individual capitalists. It thereby extends the foundation of production on a larger scale, and also specifically capitalist methods of production. The growth of society's capital takes place through the growth of many individual masses of capital. If all other conditions remain the same, individual masses of capital increase, and the concentration of the means of production increases along with them, in proportion to their size as fractional parts of society's total capital. At the same time, offshoots become detached from the original capital and begin to function as new and independent masses of capital. Among other factors, the division of wealth within capitalist families plays an important role here. As capital accumulates, the number of capitalists thus increases to a greater or lesser extent. 2 points are central to this kind of concentration, which is directly based on accumulation, or better, is the same thing as accumulation. First, the growing concentration of society's means of production in the hands of individual capitalists will be limited by the rate at which society's wealth grows, as long as all other conditions stay the same. Second, the share of society's capital located in each individual sphere of production is divided among many capitalists, whose relation to one another is that of competing independent commodity producers. What happens then isn't simply that accumulation and the concentration that goes with it are scattered over many points. New masses of capital form, and old ones are split up, which halts the growth of functioning masses. If on the one hand, accumulation presents itself as the increasing concentration of both the means of production and the command over labor, it also presents itself as many individual masses of capital being repelled from one another. This fragmentation of society's total capital into many individual masses of capital, or the repulsion of its fractional parts from one another, is counteracted by their attraction. We're no longer dealing with a simple concentration of the means of production and the command over labor that is identical to accumulation. Rather, we have here the concentration of masses of capital that have already been formed, which means that these masses lose their independence. Capitalists expropriate other capitalists, and many smaller masses of capital are transformed into fewer, larger ones. This process differs from simple concentration in that it presupposes only changes in how the already available and functioning masses of capital are distributed. Thus, its field of activity isn't limited by the absolute growth of society's wealth, or, that is, the absolute limits of accumulation. Capital burgeons into large quantities in a single set of hands in one place because many sets have lost it elsewhere. This is concentration proper, as opposed to accumulation. We aren't yet in position to explicate the laws of such concentration, i.e., the laws of how capital attracts capital. For now, a few brief factual points will suffice. The battle of competition plays out as the production of cheaper commodities. Cheaper commodities depend, ceteris paribus, on labor's productivity, which in turn depends on the scale of production. Hence, the larger masses of capital defeat the smaller ones. Moreover, we will recall that as the capitalist mode of production becomes more advanced, the minimum amount of individual capital needed to run a business under its normal condition increases. The smaller masses of capital therefore throng to spheres of production that large-scale industry has taken control of only partially, or controls only sporadically. Here, competition rages in direct proportion to the number of rival masses of capital, while its intensity is inversely proportional to their size. The battles always end with the demise of many small capitalists and with their masses of capital winding up in the pockets of the winner. Aside from this, a new force emerges as capitalist production takes place: the credit system. Not only does it become a powerful weapon in the fight that is competition, but using invisible threads, it reels in money resources that are strewn over the surface of society in larger or smaller amounts, putting them into the hands of individual or associated capitalists. It functions as special machinery for bringing about the concentration of capital. The concentration of individual masses of capital, or the process whereby they are brought together, becomes more intense in proportion to how much the specific capitalist mode of production develops as accumulation does. Concentration, for its part, becomes one of the powerful mechanisms of their development, at once shortening and accelerating the transformation of scattered production processes into socially combined ones that are carried out on a large scale. The increasing size of individual masses of capital becomes the material basis for permanently revolutionizing the mode of production. The capitalist mode of production continuously conquers branches of labor that hadn't been brought under its rule at all, or that had been brought under it only sporadically or formally. Meanwhile, new branches of labor grow from the soil of such production, thus belonging to it from the start. And finally, in the branches of labor already being run in the capitalist way, labor's productivity ripens as though in a hothouse. In all these cases, the number of workers falls relative to the amount of the means of production the workers work with and on. The share of capital transformed into means of production keeps increasing. The share transformed into labor power keeps decreasing. As the means of production become larger and more concentrated and their technological efficiency increases, they function less and less as means of employing workers. A steam plow is a vastly more efficient means of production than a regular plow, but compared with what it would be if it were realized in regular plows, the capital value that goes into the steam version is a vastly smaller means for putting people to work. At first, it is precisely adding new capital to old capital that makes it possible to enlarge the objective factors required by production process and bring required by a production process and bring about their technological transformation. But soon, the change, composition, and new technology take control to a greater or lesser extent of all the old capital that has reached the point where it is due to be reproduced and thus replaced. Like concentration, this metamorphosis of the old capital is to some degree independent of how much society's capital grows in absolute terms. But concentration, which merely redistributes the social capital that already exists, fusing many masses of capital into one large mass, also functions here as a powerful agent in transforming old capital. The additional capital that forms in the course of accumulation attracts fewer and fewer workers relative to its magnitude, while at the same time, the old capital reproduced in a new composition repels more and more of the workers it formerly employed. Section 3, the progressive production of a relative surplus population or an industrial reserve army. The accumulation of capital, which earlier appeared merely as a quantitative enlargement, occurs, as we have seen, when capital's composition keeps changing qualitatively, i.e., when its constant part keeps increasing at the expense of its variable part. The specifically capitalist mode of production, the development of labor's productive power that goes with it, and the change in capital's organic composition caused by increased productive power don't simply match strides with the progress of accumulation or the growth of society's wealth. They advance at a much faster rate because, as simple accumulation occurs in the total capital, thus increases in absolute terms, that capital's individual elements become increasingly concentrated, and because the technological transformation of the surplus capital is accompanied by the technological transformation of the original capital. As accumulation advances, then, the ratio between constant capital and variable capital is transformed. If it was originally 1 to 1, it becomes 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1, 7 to 1, etc. So, as a mass of capital increases, less than 1/2 of its total value will be turned into variable capital, and the share spent on labor power will become progressively smaller, going from 1/3 to 1/4, 1/5, 1/6, 1/8, and so on. While in contrast, 2/3, 3/4, 4/5, 5/6, 7/8 of the capital is transformed into the means of production. Because the demand for labor is determined by the magnitude of capital's variable part and not the total capital, this demand becomes progressively smaller as the total capital increases, instead of increasing in proportion to it, which is what we presupposed earlier. The demand for labor falls relative to the magnitude of the total capital. As that magnitude increases, and it falls at an accelerated rate. Of course, when the total capital is enlarged, its variable component, the labor power incorporated into it, is as well, but in a proportion that keeps getting smaller. One result is that the contraction of immediate pauses where accumulation simply expands production based on existing technology. An accumulation of the total capital that accelerates more and more is needed in order for additional workers to be absorbed, and also in order just to retain the ones already employed, owing to the constant metamorphosis of old capital. Not only that, increasing accumulation and concentration cause further changes in the composition of capital, or capital's variable part, to be further reduced as compared with the constant part at an accelerated rate. This accelerated relative decrease in the variable part goes with the accelerated increase of the total capital, moving, however, even more rapidly. At the other pole, it takes the inverse form, in which the working population seems to increase in absolute terms, and to always do so more rapidly than the variable capital or the means of employment. Yet it is capitalist accumulation itself that continuously produces a population that is too large relative to capital's average valorization needs, and thus superfluous, or in other words, a surplus population of workers, with the size of that population varying according to the extent and energy of accumulation. As for society's total capital, the movement of its accumulation sometimes brings about periodic changes, and sometimes it distributes various phases among the different spheres of production simultaneously. In some spheres, simple concentration causes the composition of capital to change without any growth occurring in capital's absolute magnitude. In others, capital wouldn't grow in absolute terms if its variable part or its labor power it absorbs didn't decrease in absolute terms. In still other spheres, capital at times continues to increase based on existing technology, attracting additional labor power in proportion to its growth, while at other times, an organic change occurs and capital's variable part contracts. In all spheres, the growth of capital's variable part, and thus of the number of workers employed, is always bound up with violent fluctuations in the temporary production of a surplus population. Whether this takes its more conspicuous form, i.e., employed workers are pushed out of jobs, or its less visible but no less consequential form, i.e., it becomes harder to absorb additional workers through their usual run-off canals. Capital's greater attraction of workers goes with their greater repulsion. The scale on which this happens expands according to the amount of society's capital already functioning and the extent of its growth. And also as the scale of production expands, the number of workers set in motion increases, the productive power of their labor develops further, and the stream that is the source of all wealth becomes wider and stronger. Moreover, capital's organic composition and technological form change at a faster rate as those things happen, and the number of spheres affected by the change increases, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes not. Thus, the population of workers that produces the accumulation of capital thereby also produces, in progressively larger amounts, the means by which their own relative superfluidity is brought about. This is a population law peculiar to the capitalist mode of production, and in fact, every peculiar historical mode of production has its own. And in fact, every particular historical mode of production has its own laws of population, which hold only for individual historical moments. An abstract law of population exists only for plants and animals, albeit only if human beings refrain from historical interventions into their lives. If a surplus population of workers necessarily results when accumulation occurs, or when wealth develops based on capitalist production, such a population also becomes, on the other hand, a mechanism of capitalist accumulation, and even one of the conditions that allow the capitalist mode of production to exist. This surplus population of workers forms a disposable industrial reserve army that belongs to capital absolutely, just as much as it would if capital had bred it at its own expense. With capital's valorization requirements constantly in flux, the surplus population supplies human material that is always ready to be exploited, doing so independently of the limits of general population growth. As capital accumulates, and as its accumulation is accompanied by increases in labor's productive power, the power of capital to expand by leaps and bounds increases as well. It increases not only because the functioning capital's elasticity does too, not only because absolute wealth, of which capital is merely an elastic part, grows, and not only because credit, when moved by special stimuli, hastens to put an unusual amount of that wealth at production's disposal in the form of surplus capital. This power of capital's also increases because the technological conditions of the production process, machinery, the means of transportation, etc., now make it possible to rapidly and expansively transform surplus product into additional means of production. The mass of social wealth that burgeons as accumulation advances and that can be turned into additional capital frantically pushes its way into old branches of production whose markets suddenly expand, or into newly opened branches such as railroads, which meet needs arising from the development of the old branches. In all such cases, it must be possible to suddenly move great masses of people to key points without shrinking the scale of production elsewhere. The surplus population supplies these people. Modern industry's characteristic path, a 10-year cycle of periods of average activity, high-intensity production, crises, and stagnation, all of which are interrupted by smaller oscillations, turns on the constant formation, the more or less extensive absorption, and the replenishment of an industrial reserve army or surplus population. Meanwhile, the different phases of the industrial cycle help pull workers into the surplus population. They become one of its most energetic agents of reproduction. We don't find this modern industry's peculiar path at any previous age, and it couldn't have occurred during the childhood of capitalist production. Capital's composition changed only quite gradually back then. So, on the whole, proportional growth in the demand for labor has corresponded to the accumulation of capital. Its accumulation advanced slowly, measured against the pace of progress in the modern epoch, and in the exploitable working population it ran up against a natural obstacle that could be overcome only with violent measures, as we will later see. The scale of production has to expand in fits and starts before it can contract as suddenly, which leads to expansion again, expansion that can't happen without disposable human material, or if the number of workers doesn't increase independently of absolute population growth. This increase results from the simple process that continuously sets one part of the workers free, quote unquote, or in other words, the methods that lower the number of employed workers in proportion to increased production. Modern industry's whole form of movement thus proceeds from the constant transformation of one part of working population into unemployed or semi-employed hands. Political economy's lack of depth comes to light precisely where it makes the expansion and contraction of credit a mere symptom of the industrial cycle's alternating periods into their cause. Just like the heavenly bodies, which always repeat the same movement once they have been flung into it, social production maintains the movement it is flung into, alternately expanding and contracting. Effects become causes, and the various ups and downs of the entire process, which continually reproduces the condition it requires, take on the form of periodicity. Once this form has become established, even political economy is able to grasp that the production of a relative superfluous population exceeding capital's average valorization needs constitutes one of the conditions that allow modern industry to exist. Suppose, says Herman Merivale, once a professor of political economy at Oxford and later an official in England's colonial ministry, quote, suppose that on the occasion of some one of these crises, the nation were to rouse itself to the effort of getting rid, by emigration, of some hundreds of thousands of superfluous arms, what would be the consequence? That at first returning demand for labor, there would be a deficiency. However rapid reproduction may be, it takes at all events the space of a generation to replace the loss of adult labor. Now, the profits of our manufacturers depend mainly on the power of making use of the prosperous moment when demand is brisk, and thus compensating themselves for the interval during which it is slack. This power is secured to them only by the command of machinery and of manual labor. They must have hands ready by them. They must be able to increase the activity of their operations when required, and to slacken it again according to the state of the market. Or they cannot possibly maintain that preeminence in the race of competition on which the wealth of the country is founded, unquote. Even Malthus could see that the modern industry depends on a surplus population which he treated, in his limited way, as an absolute surfeit stemming from the growth of the working population, and not as workers who have been made relatively superfluous. He wrote, quote, prudential habits with regard to marriage carried to a considerable extent among the laboring class of a country mainly depending on manufactures and commerce might injure it. From the nature of a population, an increase of laborers cannot be brought into market in consequence of a particular demand until after the lapse of 16 or 18 years, and the conversion of revenue into capital by saving may take place much more rapidly. A country is always liable to an increase in the quantity of the funds for the maintenance of labor faster than the increase of the population, unquote. In this way, political economy declared that in order for capitalist accumulation to keep taking place, a relative surplus population of workers has to keep forming. And having done that, it assumed the apt shape of an old spinster and put into the mouth of its ideal capitalists these words, which were meant for workers who had been made, quote unquote, redundant, i.e., jobless, by the surplus capital they themselves created. Quote, we manufacturers do what we can for you in increasing the capital on which you are to subsist, and you must do the rest by proportioning your numbers to the means of subsistence. Capitalist production cannot be satisfied with the amount of disposable labor power that natural population growth provides. Rather, its free play requires an industrial reserve army that isn't held back by that natural limit. We have been presupposing that when variable capital increases or decreases, these movements correspond exactly to how much the number of workers employed grows or shrinks. But the number of workers whom a mass of variable capital commands can stay the same, or in fact fall, as that capital is enlarged. This will happen if individual workers supply a greater amount of labor and thus receive a larger wage, while the price of labor remains constant or even decreases, as long as it decreases more slowly than the amount of labor increases. The growth of variable capital would then indicate that a greater amount of labor is being performed, but not necessarily that a greater number of workers are being employed. Every capitalist has an absolute interest in squeezing a given amount of labor out of a smaller number of workers as inexpensively as, or even more inexpensively than, a greater number of them. With more workers, the outlay of constant capital increases in proportion to how much labor is set in motion, whereas with fewer workers, the increase is much slower. The larger the scale of production, the greater the role this motive plays. It bulks even larger as the accumulation of capital advances. As we have seen, when the capitalist mode of production and also labor's productive power develop further, processes that are at once a cause and effect of accumulation, the capitalist can set more labor in motion with the same outlay of variable capital by exploiting individual bearers of labor power more extensively or intensively. We've also seen how he purchases a greater amount of labor power with the same amount of capital value. More and more, the capitalist hires unskilled workers instead of skilled ones, inexperienced workers instead of mature ones, female workers instead of male workers, and the labor power of children or teens instead of that of adults. On the one hand, then, a greater amount of variable capital sets more labor in motion in the course of accumulation, but without employing a greater number of workers, while, on the other hand, the same amount of variable capital sets more labor in motion with no increase in the amount of labor power. And finally, a greater number of unskilled bearers of labor power are set in motion by casting aside skilled bearers of labor power. A relative surplus population is therefore produced, or workers are set free faster than the technological transformation of the production process occurs, even though this transformation is accelerated by accumulation and also faster than the corresponding contraction of the variable capital relative to the constant part. If the means of production serve less and less as means of employment as they become larger and more powerful, this relation is in turn modified because capital increases its supply of labor faster than its demand for workers, doing so in proportion to the increase in labor's productive power. The overwork produced by the employed members of the working class swells the ranks of the reserve army, while competition from the latter group exerts pressure on the former one, forcing it to do overwork and comply with all of capital's demands. This process, whereby the overwork of some members of the working class condemns the other members to forced idleness and vice versa, functions as a way for the individual capitalist to increase his wealth. And it also accelerates the production of an industrial reserve army on a scale commensurate with the advance of social accumulation. The case of England illustrates how much this factor does to form a relative surplus population. England's technological means for saving labor are enormous. But if tomorrow labor were universally limited to a rational amount and then assigned to different sections of the working class according to age and sex, the available population of workers would be absolutely insufficient to carry out national production on its current scale. the great majority of workers who are non-productive at present would have to be transformed into productive ones. For the most part, the general movement of wages is regulated solely by the expansion and contraction of the industrial reserve army, which in turn corresponds to the periodic alternations of the industrial cycle. It isn't then the varying absolute number of workers that determines the movement of wages. Rather, it's the varying ratios in which members of the working class make up the active and reserve industrial armies. In other words, what determines their movement is how much the relative size of the surplus population grows or shrinks, or the extent to which it is absorbed and then set free once again. Since modern industry has a 10-year cycle with periodic phases, which, moreover, are interfered with by irregular oscillations that keep occurring more and more frequently in the course of accumulation, it would be nice to have a law that makes capital's movement depend on how much the population increases or declines in absolute terms, instead of doing the inverse, namely regulating the supply and demand of labor according to how much capital expands or contracts, or according to what capital's valorization needs happen to be, with the result that the labor market now appears as relatively undersupplied because capital is expanding, now again as oversupplied because it is contracting. Yet this is the economist's dogma, according to which wages rise as a result of capital's accumulation. Increased wages, for their part, spur accelerated population growth among workers, which goes on until the labor market is saturated, i.e., the supply of workers exceeds that of capital. Then wages sink. And now we see the other side of the coin. Falling wages gradually thin out the working population, thereby causing the supply of capital to again exceed that of labor, or as others explain it, falling wages and the increased exploitation of workers that goes with them accelerate accumulation, while at the same time the lower wages curb population growth among members of the working class. Thus we see the return of a ratio where the demand for labor is greater than the supply, wages rise, and so on. What a beautiful system of movement this would be for advanced capitalist production. The time for the industrial campaign for fighting the battle to its conclusion would be over long before higher wages could produce a positive increase of the population truly fit for work. A wage increase that was in practice purely nominal occurred in England's agricultural districts between 1849 and 1859 as the price of grain was falling. In Wiltshire, for example, the weekly wage rose from 7 shillings to 8. In Dorsetshire, it went from 7 or 8 shillings to 9, and so on. This was a consequence of a larger than normal exodus on the part of the agricultural surplus population, which was brought about by wartime demand and also the massive expansion of railroad construction, factories, mines, etc. The lower wages are, the higher the percentage change resulting from every insignificant wage increase. If the weekly wage is 20 shillings and it increases to 22 shillings, then the wage has risen by 10%. But if the weekly wage is only 7 shillings and it rises to 9 shillings, there's a 28 and 4/7 increase, which sounds like a lot. Farmers howled in protest, and in discussing this starvation wage, even the London economists maundered on earnestly about, quote, a general and substantial advance, unquote. What did the farmers do? Did they wait until the population of farm laborers had increased so much due to this amazing remuneration that wages had to fall? This is how the situation played out in the political economists' dogmatic heads. They did not. Instead, they introduced more machinery, and in no time there was such a surfeit of workers that even the farmers were satisfied. More capital than before was put into agriculture, and in a more productive form. And when this happened, the demand for labor fell in both relative and absolute terms. The political economist fiction we have been discussing confuses two sets of laws: the ones that regulate the general movement of wages, or the ratio of the working class and society's total capital, with the laws that distribute the working population among the different spheres of production. If business is good in a particular sphere, and as a result accumulation becomes especially robust, this drives profits there above the average level, prompting additional capital to stream in. Needless to say, both the demand for labor and wages will rise. The higher wages will attract a greater share of the working population to the happy sphere until the demand for labor power is satisfied, which will cause wages to gradually recede to their previous average level, or if too much labor power has pressed its way in, they will drop to a level even lower than that. When the political economist thinks he sees here is how and why the number of workers increase in absolute terms when wages rise, and then wages fall when the number of workers increases in absolute terms. But what he really sees are only the local oscillations of the labor market in a particular sphere of production, only phenomena arising from the redistribution of the working population among the different spheres that capital flows into according to its changing needs. During periods of stagnation and average prosperity, the industrial reserve army or relative surplus population has the effect of putting pressure on the active army, and during periods of overproduction and paroxysm, the former army causes the latter one to keep its hopes in check. The relative surplus population thus conditions how the law of labor supply and demand operates. It imposes limits on the law's field of action that absolutely accommodate capital's greedy appetite for exploiting workers and its compulsion to dominate them. This is the right place to come back to one of the greatest feats of economic apologetics. We will recall that when new machines are introduced or old machines are enlarged, part of the variable capital is transformed into constant capital. The apologists take this operation, which fixes capital, thereby setting workers free, and turn it around. According to them, it sets capital free for the worker. Not only are we in a position to fully appreciate the apologist's shamelessness, for the workers directly cast aside by machines aren't the only ones set free. So are their future replacements, and also the additional contingent regularly absorbed when, supported by its old foundation, industry expanded as usual. Old capital isn't set free for workers, but workers are set free for additional capital. So in other words, the mechanism of capitalist production sees to it that when capital grows in absolute terms, no corresponding increase occurs in the general demand for labor. And the apologists call this the compensation that displaced workers get for the misery, pain, and possibility of death they have to deal with during the transitional period when they're banished into the reserve army. The demand for labor isn't identical to capital's growth, nor is the supply of labor identical to the growth of the working class. What we have here isn't a case of two independent forces acting upon each other. Le descent pipe. Capital acts on both sides at once. If, on the one hand, capital's accumulation increases the demand for labor, on the other hand, it increases the supply of workers by setting them free. At the same time, the pressure that the existence of unemployed workers puts on the employed ones forces the latter group to set more labor in motion, which makes the supply of labor independent of the supply of workers, at least to a certain extent. When the law of supply and demand operates on this basis, its movement seals capital's despotic control. Hence, the moment workers solve the mystery of how it is that the more they work, the more wealth they produce for others, and the more the productive power of their labor increases, the more precarious even their function as capital's means of valorization becomes. The moment they discover that the intensity of the competition between them depends entirely on the pressure arising from the relative surplus population, the moment they attempt to organize trade unions and thus systematic collaboration between employed and unemployed workers so as to stop or at least mitigate the ruinous effects that this natural law of capitalist production has on the working class, the moment these things happen, capital and its sycophant political economy start crying bloody murder over how the eternal and, so to speak, sacred law of supply and demand has been violated. All alliances between the employed and the unemployed disturb the pure functioning of the law. Yet the moment unfavorable conditions, say in the colonies, make it hard to create an industrial reserve army and thus render the working class absolutely dependent on the capitalist class, capital rebels against this same sacred law of supply and demand. Together with its platitude-loving Sancho Panza, it tries to forcibly bend the law to its interests. Section 4, and I'm going to stop just simply because we're not going to get to the end. I am predicting we're not going to get to the end of this little thing here, and I got in late, and I've yammered far beyond what I should be yammering. I think you get the sense of this. I will, at another moment, produce a lengthier and complete addendum to this that reads till the end of the text, including the editor's endnotes at least. But I think I will stop the live stream now because I think I've exceeded the limits of everyone. So let me see if there are questions up till now. Yeah, Larry had to go to a party. Disposal of human materials, just like heavenly bodies. Physics again, absorbing workers. Given the application of physics to economics, we could make similar application, but with the growth and function of the human body, brain to economics, capitalism. Indeed, yes. Limits of accumulation. Distracted and addicted. Yeah, there we go. Here we go. So I will stop that. Stop share.